This podcast is produced by the team behind the Answered the Call, Australian History, How to Research, World War I, Australian Imperial Force Soldiers, 1914 to 1918 online course. If you're not sure where to start or find navigating websites confusing, this easy to use and practical online course will show you how to confidently research military sources, records, and more. Check out the course webinar at the hyperlink answeredthecall.mykajabi.com for the details of how you can reveal your family's fascinating military history. G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Dr. Meleah Hampton from the Australian War Memorial in Canberra and author of Attacks on the Somme and the Battle of Pozieres in 1916. And she's joined us today to talk about the Battle of Hazebrouck, which involved the AIF in 1918. Hi Mel, thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No, Mel, thank you for coming on the show and telling us a little bit about the Battle of Hazebrouck. And so just tell the listeners, how did you get into military history?
It's something I've been interested in since I was a kid, and I think I came to it with perhaps an interest that is more typical of women in interest in loss and memory and commemoration. But I became a veterinary nurse after school and lived overseas and was going to the battlefields more and more often. And I was reading a book by Robin Pryor and Trevor Wilson on the battlefield about which it was written, and I realised actually my abiding passion is operations and understanding how the war was fought, and not needing to use words like futility and hopelessness, actually understanding what the deal was. And here I am today.
So how did you end up at the Australian War Memorial, Mel?
I applied for a job and those suckers gave me one. I think as an Australian military historian, that is among the highest honours it is to work at the national institution for the commemoration of Australian participation in military matters. And I am still slightly gobsmacked that I'm employed there. I feel very, very lucky.
For the listeners, what does a general day entail for you at the Australian War Memorial?
Well, I mean, it can be anything. Generally, it's researching something. It may be researching something for a speech for somebody in particular, or for a last post ceremony that we hold every night at the memorial and broadcast online, and you can watch it on Facebook, everybody. But, it's generally trying to research something that is underpinning the activity of the memorial, whether it's what someone's saying, what someone's putting into an exhibit, or anything like that.
It's a great job that you and your fellow co-workers do, and the great historians that they are. It's an amazing what you do to remember the soldiers and the men and women that have gone before us. So, getting into today's topic, can you give the concept a little bit of what was going on? Can you just tell the listeners what was happening at the end of 1917 and the lead up to the Battle of Hazebrouck and the challenges that were faced by the Allies?
Okay, so there's the end of 1917 ends with the stalemate resuming. The war on the Western Front is fought seasonally, so there's not a lot of point in fighting over the winter months because it's cold and difficult. So things tend to slow down for winter. So the war in 1917 has been not a great success. It started out, the campaigning season starts out in March for the May and April for the Australians, with the battles of Bullecourt, which aren't great. Messines in the middle of the year is good, but the Battle of Passchendaele, 3rd Ypres at the end of the year, is very mixed. It is mostly disastrous, incredibly bogged down. And then there's little jewels of success. So some of the Australian battles at Menin Road, successful within this morass. And for the British overall, there is a very successful attack, the first day of which is very successful further south at Cambrai, where tanks are really used to their best effect. So there are promising signs in the midst of not a lot of success overall, I guess.
So that was the end of 1917, and then we move into 1918. So for the listeners who aren't familiar with what occurred in 1918, what was the German Spring Offensive, and what was the why was it important at that stage of the war?
Okay, so when we think about the First World War, you sort of think about these two sides going hard at it and having a go at each other, but actually the Germans conducted very few major offensives, like large-scale concerted attempts to move the line. So they launched the war with the Schlieffen Plan, that big push through, and then the next one that they do is against Verdun, like that major operation against Verdun. But other than that, they're already in French and Belgian territory. So technically, they've already won. They've gained territory. They're winning the war. They're good. So they have sat there for a very, very long time and proven very hard to dislodge. Particularly in the beginning of 1917, they've withdrawn to a very well established line called the Hindenburg Line, deep dugouts that have extensive sort of forwards and backwards it's sort of really wide trench system with wire and things that can be miles deep, and so they've got no reason to move. But in 1917, they're facing the arrival of the Americans on the Western Front potentially. Russia has just withdrawn from the war, so they've got a bunch of men who've been fighting on the Eastern Front, and so the time is ripe to do something before the Allies are bolstered by huge numbers of Americans actually reaching the front line and being operational. So they roll the dice, and on the 21st of March, they launch the first of a series of major offensives.
So those major offensives that they launched, were they, in your opinion, Mel, were the Germans close to winning the war from those offensives that they launched?
No, it's a complicated question because warfare on the Western Front is a really complicated matter, and there is a really fundamental difference between what the Germans are doing and what the Allies are doing, and they just don't look the same. What the Germans do when they launch their attack is they rely on manpower to do it. They have these crack troops they call stormtroops, which is one of my favourite parts of the war. And the stormtroops, they just launch their attack, and these guys just go and they don't worry about anything. They sort of bust through lines and just keep going. And then there's moppers up that come along behind and deal with leftover batches of infantry and artillery that's been swamped by these crack troops just pushing on through. Now, that is very effective, obviously, because they take kilometres of ground doing this, but what it costs them is all of their best troops, because they end up having a very heavy casualty rate. It costs them the ability to control their army in terms of communication, in terms of supply, both in ammunition and food and water and anything else. And so they stretch really thin and they really struggle with what's going on. So it looks great, but fundamentally it's not going to work in the long run.
What I've studied and what I've read, basically what we could say is that the Germans just basically they just drove big bulges in the line, didn't they? Essentially that was really what they did.
Yeah, what they're trying to do is break through that line, right? So the whole idea, and this has been the idea behind a lot of the Allies' attacks, particularly on the Somme, and also at Bullecourt and in 30, but they're still trying to break through the lines. But the Western Front is 50 miles deep. It's not just the trenches in the front line or even the support trenches behind that or the communication trenches behind that. It just goes back and back and back, and there's towns involved, there's fortifications that just go, and that's really obvious when the Germans just cannot break that line. There's just too many men, too much material, and too much capacity to defend things. So when the Allies launched their attack, their major offensive, they slow the German spring offensive. And if you compare what the Germans did to the Allies' attack on the 8th of August and what comes afterwards, they're no longer trying to break through the line. They're just going to push the whole line back. And that's what the Allies are able to do. That line, if you look at the end of the war and you plot all the positions, the line is straight, and all those bulges that the Germans pushed into it are gone, because the war is not going to be won by breaking through. It's going to be won by grinding them all back.
As we've both studied, Mel, it's just pure hard fighting that really essentially wins the war. Pure and utter, and many men are sacrificed for that victory.
Yes, yeah, they are. It's a difficult one to look at because, if you start looking at it in terms of individuals and, we're Australians, we're from a small nation, and it's easy to look at people that were lost to us as a nation and think, well, that's significant enough to have actually made a difference. So 60 odd thousand men died, others who come back a bit broken, the ones that come back and cope, how many more of those could we have used, like that, but saying that, there is a major threat to Europe, which is this expansive militaristic Germany sat in the middle of the continent. And once they start behaving like that, it's in nobody's interest to allow them to just keep expanding in Europe. It won't work. So that's sort of why it had to happen.
Yeah, at a heavy cost, which we both have looked at and studied. And so, recognising the threat to the Allies, General Sir Douglas Haig ordered the British and Commonwealth forces to hold their ground and moved the 1st Australian Division by rail to cover Hazebrouck. Why did he choose the 1st Australian Division? Were they the closest, or was there another reason why he chose the 1st Australian Division to go to Hazebrouck?
It's all logistics at the moment. That he has got hundreds of divisions available to him, and he's not going to be shifting anyone for any other reason than they are available and they're good to go. So it'd be nice to think that he thinks the Australians are going to be the best and the most effective at clogging that gap, but actually he may have chosen them as being better out of the 5 that were nearby, but it's not much of a distinction. He's in a hurry.
Why is Hazebrouck important to the Allies, Mel? Why is it important?
Well, anywhere that the Germans are going to try and break through is important, but Hazebrouck in particular is a railhead, and the railways are a critical means of moving quickly in a world where your army marches and the really fast ones ride horses. So getting access to the railways is really important, and the railways run to the coast and to France and to Paris. So those are the places that you really need to protect. And it's the same thing we see further south, in a few months at Amiens and Villers-Bretonneux are again an even more important railhead on the railway to Paris.
So it basically, the railway, they are important because they supply food, ammunition, everything that the men at the front need to keep fighting.
Yeah, that is absolutely the case. Australians would be very familiar with Hazebrouck. They come through on the train. They would have spent time at the station, possibly even gotten off or been stationed nearby because it's not far from Armentières, where there's lots of army camps. And yeah, disrupting supply route is really important, but using it for your own ends to try and get to Paris is also important.
Were the Germans aware that Hazebrouck was a key strategic to take it? Did they realise that it was a weakness in the Allied lines?
I don't know specifically what the German intelligence was. I don't think they could have a reasonable expectation that Hazebrouck was particularly weak. And I don't think they really thought about much else other than what they needed to get to. Everywhere could be expected to be as strongly defended as anywhere else. They were thinking about their own offensive gains and what they would benefit from capturing. So they were really looking for benefit rather than easy.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you just said. It makes it very, you can sort of see from the Germans' perspective, but you can see it from the Allied perspective as well.
Yeah, well, if you think about when the Allies decided to attack, they are sort of looking for a weak point, but mostly, the defining feature of the Western Front is this continuous nature of defences. There's not a weak point because it's just a long line that never ends. So, weak points are for when you want to circle around something or, push through a small bit and then circle around, and that they just don't exist. They're only very minor. So, yeah, they're hard to build into your plans.
And We should say, Mel, for the listeners, the Western Front was over 700 kilometres. So, and it stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. So, and you had different parts of the British and the Australians and the other allies that were fighting, and then you had the French sector. You had the Americans. It's a very big and complex war when we look at it and study it.
Oh, absolutely. And if you look at what was going on before the war, military doctrine was you fought wars in wars of movement. So you approached your enemy, and then while you're engaging with them, you would send your scouts around the side or your cavalry around and outflank them and maneuver around them. And maneuver was built into all the warfare plans. So what the Western Front does is this long interlocked series of trenches where you cannot go around them, because if you go into Switzerland, you're in all sorts of trouble, and if you go into the sea, you're going to drown. So there's no movement, and so they have to rethink all of their approaches to war, which is incredibly difficult.
So with the situation of obviously the Germans, so we're in Hazebrouck now. The fighting's going on. So with the situation looking grim, Haig motivates his troops with the Australians, and official war correspondent Charles Bean said, with his backs to the wall appeal. I just want to read the quote for the listeners, and then I'd like to get your comments. So this is Haig saying, and so it's got. 3 weeks ago to the day, the enemy began his terrific attacks against us on a 50-mile front. His objectives are to separate us from the French, to take the Channel ports and destroy the British Army. There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall, and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight to the end. With that statement, Mel, what's your opinion? Were we in a dire strait, or was it a bit of an overreaction?
There's two ways of looking at it. One is with 100 years of hindsight, and one is in the mind of Haig at the time. And with 100 years of hindsight, we can say that a good staunch defence worked, and the Germans exhausted themselves, and so it, perhaps it was always going to end that way. Who knows? But for the people on the ground, having an army that has been static for several years suddenly launch itself at you and start to succeed, it is desperate and it is terrifying, and it is a case of throw everything at it or go home, because that's what they've been there for all those years. And so all of this stuff. And the other thing is, while it's difficult and terrifying, every decision is costing lives as well. So every level of the British Army and the French Army and all of the Dominions and colonial armies that are there, every time they make a decision, somebody dies, whether it's to send someone back for food or not. It's really a desperate situation, and making decisions in that is hard. And so this sort of desperate and rousing speech that this is it, our backs to the wall, come on men, is is in part born of this, oh my God, what is going on? What are we going to do this sort of feeling from the guys saying it, but also to try and rouse that sort of feeling in others, because this is where the war is really hitting the road now.
So, in your opinion, Mel, do you feel that the General Haig and other generals, do you feel that the criticism that they were given for the losses after the war, do you feel it's justified or no?
It was a long time after the war that those things started to happen, a decade at least. Haig ended the war as a hero. When he died in 1927, I think, hundreds of thousands of people walked past his grave as a sign of respect. So it's only after you sort of get these biographies and, All Quiet on the Western Front, but the British biographies, Siegfried for Sassoon and those sorts of things, that people start marrying the actions of Haig to the high casualty rate of the war, to say that first. So it's not necessarily that Haig has always been considered the master of disaster. He has had a very high a great deal of respect, particularly among the combatants who experienced all of this stuff. Now, as far as modern day stuff, I mean, from the 60s in particular, academics have looked at Haig. Alan Clark wrote a book called Lions Led by Donkeys, meaning that the British officers were donkeys. An Australian historian, John Laffin, wrote a book called British Butchers and Bunglers of the First World War. I'm not on that side of the fence. I sit in the middle where everything is really confusing and murky, because Haig and his army commanders and his British, corps commanders aren't morons. These are educated people, and they're not idiots, but what they are trying to do is learn lessons where they've spent 30 or 40 years learning the wrong one in army colleges and in mobile wars in the Sudan, in South Africa. So all the lessons they've learnt have been absolutely the opposite to what they're now fighting on the Western Front. And every time they try to fix it, people get killed in vast numbers in some cases. So they are stuck in a situation where it is incredibly difficult. Their professional education isn't helping, and they are doing the best that they can. Are some of them making dumb decisions? Absolutely. Are some of them not very good at their jobs? Absolutely. But to just call them morons who are out to get as many people killed as possible is incredibly unfair and also incorrect.
Well, you would say, Mel, and from the studies that you've done and others have done, that a general he wouldn't want to get his men killed, because by 1918 they were few and far between, and if you kill an experienced soldier, you've got to then train someone up again, and all that experience that's died with the other person, you've now got to train that again, and then that weakens your force that you're sending into battle. So a general didn't want to send men in and see his whole force basically annihilated.
No, and this is why over the course of the war, the Allies, who are conducting annual offensives and regular attacks on the line with intent to capture significant portions of ground, as opposed to the German counterattack plans, these guys are learning that what they need to do is replace manpower with firepower, artillery, tanks, aircraft. Everybody accepts that soldiers' lives are going to be lost. They're slightly more cavalier with life, I guess, or I guess there's a greater acceptance that whatever you do, people will die. They think it's worth doing, and the guys who are doing it often think it's their duty to do or die, but they are replacing manpower with firepower as far as possible to protect those lives as they cross no man's land, which is the direct opposite of what the Germans do in 1918. They haven't learnt that lesson yet.
So we should actually, it's a good thing what you just said. We should actually discuss the tactics that were being used by the Germans and the Australians at Hazebrouck. What were they?
Well, the Germans, as we've talked about, were sending men in as quickly as possible, but obviously what is technically referred to as a buttload of artillery. Like, there's an awful lot of firepower getting, poor Hazebrouck is getting absolute pounding. Now, the Australian tactics are very different from their offensive tactics, obviously. And while the quote you said says, and every position must be held to the last man, there must be no retirement, which is the directive of Haig. That's not actually what happens. In most places, they conduct a fighting retirement because you want to stop the Germans. But part of that is to make sure they don't press your line, like break through your line. So you've got to keep your line elastic and keep it together. And as long as the flanks hold, and everyone holds together, you can stretch it a long way, and they can stretch it a really long way, as it proved.
Was that a series of posts that they set along the line, or was it like what exactly did they do?
Well, I mean, the idea is that as far as possible, you engage with the enemy, and then parts withdraw while the engagement is held up, and you're trying to hold the enemy up as you withdraw as many men as possible. And then you have this rolling engagement as you're falling back to just keep them slow, so you can get as much of your men and, more importantly, unfortunately, your stuff back as possible to keep it out of enemy hands.
We should bring it up that for the listeners who aren't aware, What was the strength of the First Division in 1918, and in 1915? What was the average strength of the battalion in 1915 to say now at Hazebrouck in 1918?
Well, formation strength of a battalion is 1,000. So you've got 4 battalions to a brigade, 3 brigades to a division. So that's a lot, 16,000 or something. So that's formation. However, not all of those would be committed to any battle. So you would hold a nucleus, what's called a nucleus back, where you have some guys from which to seed a new battalion if things go horrifically wrong. So, you'd normally send maybe 800 to 900 men of a battalion into a battle. At the beginning of 1918, the situation in the Australian battalions was not as desperate as it was about to become, but it wasn't great. They were under strength, but not desperately. So by towards the second half of the year, battalions were starting to sport 250 or 300 men, which is one company. A company of which there are 4 companies in a battalion is 250 men, and when the entire battalion is company strength, it's getting really bad. It's not that bad in during Hazebrouck. They're still at 800 or 900 at a minimum, so still pretty good, but it is about to get very, very bad.
As you have read and I have read, and as you touch on, it is about to get very desperate for the Australians, and the coming months are probably our toughest months of the war, and pretty fair to say that it could be. We were almost pushed. The men were pushed to breaking point. Would that be a fair statement of what I just said?
They were pushed to exhaustion. I guess you can say they broke when they tried to conflate battalions. At some point they run out of enough men to fill up battalions with reinforcements, and so they shut down some battalions. Now this is like guys' families, they belong to this number. And that gives them reason to go into the next battle, and that breaks them. That's when the men refuse to cooperate in many cases, and you have strikes over losing their battalion. The battles, no, the Australians don't break. And there is a lot of talk in military history about breaking points, like you said, or morale, high morale, low morale. The morale of the troops is so important. It's not. The bottom of the morale is, you can have super happy troops or you can have super grumpy troops, but if they're prepared to go into war, you're good. So, and those Australian battalions go in every time. I don't know how they turn around and walk back into that, but they do. And so that's not broken. That spirit to keep going is not it's pretty stressed, but it's not broken.
I thought I'd just put that in there and see. I wanted to see what your opinion was. So you answered that very well, Mel. Very, very well done.
It's really easy to think, those poor men, and there was a lot of whinging, it was so hard. They were exhausted. Like looking at battles like Mons and Quentin in the end of August 1918. Those guys have walked 7 or 8 miles. They've fought the whole way. They've gotten to a river they can't get across. They've walked miles back, gone around, still attacked. They still do what they're being asked to do, even if they are exhausted. They really aren't coping with it, and they really, they're falling asleep at their positions, and they're still doing what they've been asked to do, which is remarkable.
Absolutely. So what was the cost to the Australian First Division at Hazebrouck, and what was the cost for the Germans?
You've got me there. The numbers I'm not sure of. They sort of pull back, and it's a muddled sort of period of time. The Germans, they think there may be 500 to 700 that are killed. It's hard to say, and those numbers come from Australian sources, so they're very invested in saying maybe a few more than were. So we don't, I'm not sure.
Sorry, Mel.
No, you got me. Numbers I'm terrible at.
Nah, that's okay. That's okay. So why is it that the AIF in 1918, why are we, and all the studies that you read, why were we such a crack fighting force in 1918 compared to when we arrived in 1916?
Well, in 1916, we had no idea what we were doing. And by we, I mean not me, them. The Australians arrive with full of experience from Gallipoli and a bunch of new recruits, and they are thrown into the Western Front, and it is shocking to them. Shocking. The messages that are written at Pozières all are just desperate for reinforcement now, help. It's shocking. And they still function, absolutely. They have success, absolutely, but it is shocking. The 1918 guys aren't shocked by anything. They know what the deal is. They've seen it and they've been in it before. What's more important is that the Australians know how the war works. So when I was talking before about replacing men with networks of weaponry, so an overarching artillery barrage with aircraft that are spotting and delivering ammunition and covering the noise of your tanks and working with trench mortars, all of these things are something that an Australian soldier knows. Any Australian soldier, a company commander, a private soldier, and they are able to pick up orders and maps and know what's going on and carry on. So that's really important. The reason we think of Australians as crack troops on the Western Front is because they like to think of themselves as crack troops on the Western Front. There's a lot of self-promotion. And there's a lot of promotion from above. So John Monash, as commanding officer of the Australian Corps, is a big fan of his guys, and he's a big fan of promoting his men and by extension himself. So that happens. And there are other equally competent corps on the Western Front, I assure you, including the Canadians, who are Australia's neighbours. So, it is what it is. And the Australians got this excellent reputation, which they deserved, but not as a unique thing, I guess.
So, with what you've just said, and with what some Australians believe, why is it that we as a nation believe that we won the war? You hear it all the time. You hear people say, "Oh, if it wasn't until Sir John Monash took over and he virtually won the war." Why do we do it? Why do we as Australians do it?
I have no idea. But there's a place to be proud of what Australia achieved during the First World War. We were a small nation who sent a relatively small number of men, although obviously it was huge to us and significant on the Western Front. And we learnt to be really good at, murdering people. I don't know, this is war. It's still distasteful business. It's the hardest thing that a society does is fight a war. And they felt it was their duty and they did it. Now, the Australians are absolutely at the centre of what is going on in 1918 as far as the British offensive, which begins on the 8th of August. That is launched with two corps side by side, the Australians and the Canadians. And we don't take as much ground as the Canadians, so we don't get to win that one, right? The Canadians actually take a few more miles of ground. But the Australians remain central to those ongoing attacks that just rumble along. They go through Poyar, they go through Peron, they keep going and going. And they are, in many cases, conducted against all the odds. They haven't brought their artillery up at Mons and Quentin and, things that would normally make things a success. So they've done very well. And they are at the centre of this spearheading this push. But as I said earlier in the podcast, all along the line, the line straightens out and the whole line gets pushed. And after they, halfway to the end of the war, the Australians are withdrawn. Halfway of the territory taken to the end line, the Australians are withdrawn because they're broken. So people can think what they like. I don't mind. It's my opinion as someone who's been researching this for many, many years that the Australians didn't win the war on their own, but they were lucky enough to be in the middle of the actions that did win the war. So, look at it the other way around.
Yeah, I totally agree in what you said there. And in my opinion, and what I've read, that basically how I've looked at the AIF's involvement is we were part of an overall British and French victory. We helped in the overall victory that the British and French, you would say, the spearheads, if we had to supply our own artillery, we had 5 divisions fighting over there. If we had to supply our own artillery and all the maintenance of the trenches, and people don't realise that was done by the British, and also a lot of it was done by the French. So for Australia, if we had to do all that, we would only have 2 to 3 divisions fighting if we had to do all of that ourselves. So in my opinion, that I believe we were the crack troops along with the Canadians and the New Zealanders and some of the British divisions as well, but we helped in an overall British and French victory. That's my opinion, and I think you would agree with that.
Well, I think the thing that wins the war is understanding trench warfare. So it's understanding that you can't outflank your guys, and you are not going to succeed long term if you send men in. And so the side that works out how to apply their firepower effectively is the side that wins. And so you know all of this combination of things, I refer to it as a weapon system, applying that effectively, and then not trying to bust through your enemy lines, but just use everything to bite and hold, take a bite out of the enemy lines and hold it. Now, if you're talking about the British Army, which did not understand this even remotely in 1914, 1915, the Australians arrive in 1916, they still really don't understand it. They're on their way. And if you talk about what's going on in 1918, you can use the Australians as one of the best examples of how that worked. And they were at the crux of, the forefront of things like the Battle of Hamel is one of these first battles that works. And it's timed and it works and it's beautiful. The Australians didn't invent that. John Monash didn't invent that. He looked around at all these different ideas that other sometimes British, sometimes Canadian, corps officers were using and put it together for his. So they're all leaning on each other. Monash gets it more than some other corps commanders do. So if you want to give an example of how the British Army learnt and what success looked like for them, you can absolutely use the Australian Corps as an example of British tactical learning on the Western Front. And that is a very big deal, I think. I think that's a big enough deal for me. I'm happy with that.
Absolutely. No, I'd agree with that. Absolutely, 100%. I'd agree in what you just said. So basically, to sum up, how important is the fighting of Hazebrouck and for the outcome of the war, and then obviously moving forward further into 1918?
So Hazebrouck is not the most significant place where the Germans were stopped. It was important. It's more important for us as Australians as being one of the main points where we were one of the first times we were involved in stopping the German spring offensive. I guess that's where it gets its significance for us as Australians. As far as the conduct of the German spring offensive, it's just one of many places where exactly the same thing is going on. So it's not just Australians, there's all of your British units and whoever is available is getting thrown to stop this stuff. And this is what it looks like. For us, it looks like Hazebrouck. And later on, it looks like Villers-Bretonneux, so. And Dernancourt is also very important for us in that. So it's the least exciting of the typical nature of the spring offensive, I guess. That's rude. But, it's pretty typical of what's going on. And the fact that the Germans were not allowed to break through anywhere is critical to the success of the later offensives. So after that is all stopped, which is mostly, in no small part due to the Germans running out of puff, communications, ammunition, willpower to go on. It's hard. There's a pause while the British/French major offensive of the year is put together and reorganised. And during that time, the Australians are still working on their tactical capability as infantry, particularly. Hamel goes ahead, and then the Australians have sort of earned themselves a place in the launching of the major offensive, which ends the war, and that's the really important part, I think.
Absolutely. Basically, to wrap it up, what at the memorial, obviously with COVID being the memorial is closed to but what are you and your fellow historians working on at the memorial at the moment?
Well, there's lots of business as usual going on. So we are still working and preparing at doing the last post ceremony. So lots of stories. Those sorts of stories don't just come from a volume off the shelf. We find names and we've got to start from scratch. People, they're just lost. And so we're looking to research people, find out who they were, what made them them, and what happened to them in the war, and why are they on our roll of honour. We are still going ahead with our program of exhibitions. We've got an excellent exhibition coming up next year now, which is looking at war on film, and I'm involved in, and it's going to be super exciting. War on film from the earliest, from even the Boer War to the First World War and all the way up to modern cam footage. And there's other things we're doing along the lines of our own research. So my next project, which is not much of work time and a lot of my geek at home time, is looking at the battles of Bullecourt. Obviously, I've studied the battles of Pozieres in very intense depth and can tell you exactly what went wrong there. And now I want to look at Bullecourt and compare those and start to build a picture of what's going on.
Have you got any books that you've got coming up looking at to write again, or?
Well, my next book I'm hoping will be my Bullecourt book. Unfortunately, between Pozieres and now, I had twins. That's
Oh,
not
wow.
unfortunately. So I've been doing small children for a while, and so I'm really just gearing back up to publishing more soon. Soonish, hopefully.
Very, very, great thing that you do, Mel, with having twins. I take my hat off to you. Very well done. That's.
It's a weird thing to do, kids at home, and then talk about other people's kids getting killed in warfare. It's a bit confronting sometimes, but
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
weird thing to mix.
No, it is. But Mel, it's been great, and we'll definitely get you back on the show, because there's the First World War. It opens up so many topics, and that's why I love studying it. That's why you love studying it, and it's been great to get you on. And as I said in the start to the listeners, if go out and actually, if you do get a chance, buy Mel's books. They are great books. So as I said, Attack on the Somme and the Battle of Pozieres. And trust me, you won't want to put them down. So get out there and go and read history. And Mel, it's been great, and we'll definitely get you back on the show. So thank you for coming on and having a chat with us.
Cool. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a good chat.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.